The old house was always quiet, but it was a quiet full of love. For a young girl named Clara, the best sound in the world was the soft rustle of a page as her father turned it. He was a history professor, a man named Arthur, whose eyes sparkled with kindness behind his glasses. Their world was built on a foundation of quiet moments. He didn't fill the house with loud noises or big parties. Instead, he filled it with stories. He would read to her from thick, heavy books with leather covers that smelled of old paper and wisdom. In the evenings, they would sit in his favorite worn-out armchair by the fireplace, and he would tell her tales of ancient kings and forgotten empires. For Clara, her father was the greatest storyteller in the world. Her father's work was all about understanding the past to protect the future. He would often say, "We must learn from history, my dear. It teaches us how to build things that last." This belief wasn't just for his job, it was for his family too. He wanted to make sure his daughter and his wife were always safe and cared for, no matter what the future held. His wife, Eleanor, was different from him. Where Arthur was soft-spoken and thoughtful, Eleanor was full of energy and life. She had come into their lives a few years after Clara's own mother had passed away. At first, she was like a wonderful, exciting storm. She brought new music into the house, cooked spicy foods they had never tried, and laughed with a sound that could fill every room. Clara, who was just a little girl then, was fascinated by her. Eleanor seemed so strong and sure of everything. Arthur saw how happy Eleanor made his daughter, and his own heart, which had been so lonely, found comfort. He loved Eleanor for the color and warmth she brought to their quiet world. He wanted to provide for her, to make sure she never had to worry. So one afternoon, he decided to create a will, a plan for his family's future. He sat down with a kind lawyer, a friend of his, and explained his wishes very carefully. "I want to leave my entire estate to my wife, Eleanor," he said. "The house, the savings, all of it. She must be secure." But then, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious, gentle tone. "However, I have one very important condition. This is for my daughter, Clara. After Eleanor, when she is also gone, everything that remains, especially this house and my book collection, must go to Clara. It is her birthright. It is the bridge from my love for her to her future." The lawyer nodded, understanding completely. He called this special condition a bridge clause. It was like building an invisible bridge. Eleanor would live comfortably on one side for the rest of her life, but the bridge would ensure that finally, everything would cross over to Clara. It was his way of caring for both the women he loved. Arthur even tried to explain it to Clara one day. She was only 12, and the words were big and confusing. He sat her down and said, "Clara, I've made a plan for our family. All that I have will first go to Eleanor. But you must know deep inside the legal papers is a promise that in the end, the most important parts of our life here will come back to you. It is my way of watching over you always." Clara didn't fully understand the legal part, but she felt the love behind his words. She knew her father was a man who built things to last, just like the histories he taught. She trusted him completely. For a few years, life continued in this comfortable rhythm. But as Clara grew from a child into a young woman of 16, then 17, the atmosphere in the house began to change. The quiet that was once filled with love started to feel heavy. The exciting energy that Eleanor brought now sometimes felt like sharp tension. Clara was no longer a little girl who was easily amused. She had her own thoughts, her own quiet personality, which was so much like her father's. She preferred reading in her room or helping her father organize his books. She wasn't interested in the glamorous parties or the sophisticated social circles that Eleanor loved. Eleanor began to see this not as a simple difference in personality, but as a rejection. She would watch Clara and Arthur sitting together, speaking in their quiet, understanding way, and feel a pang of something bitter. She started to make comments. "Your daughter is so quiet, Arthur. Doesn't she have any friends?" she would ask, her voice light but her eyes critical. Or, when Clara would choose a simple dress over a fancy one Eleanor had picked out, she would sigh and say, "You could try a little harder, Clara. People will think I don't take care of you." Small disagreements turned into sharp arguments. Eleanor wanted Clara to study business or something useful. Clara, with her father's quiet support, wanted to study art and literature. Every time Arthur took Clara's side, even gently, a little more of the warmth between him and Eleanor faded. Eleanor started to believe that Clara was turning her husband against her. The big final fight happened just after Clara's 20th birthday. It was about something small, a missed family dinner, but all the unspoken anger and resentment of years came pouring out. Eleanor accused Clara of being ungrateful and selfish. Clara, her voice trembling with hurt, finally shouted back, telling Eleanor she would never understand the bond she had with her father. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Arthur stood between them, his face pale and tired. He looked old, much older than his years. He tried to be the peacemaker, but the damage was done. Heartbroken and feeling trapped between the two people he loved most, Clara made the difficult decision to move out. The goodbye at the door was the most painful moment of her life. Her father hugged her tightly, his eyes filled with tears, but he was too weary, too broken by the conflict to stop her. After Clara left, the house became truly quiet, but now the quiet was empty and sad. Eleanor, now alone with a grieving Arthur, fed him a steady story. She told him that Clara wanted nothing more to do with them, that she had chosen to leave them behind. She painted Clara as a cold, ungrateful daughter who had broken her father's heart. Arthur, missing his daughter terribly and weakened by sadness, started to believe it. The silence from Clara felt like proof. One evening, Eleanor approached him. "Arthur, we need to update the will," she said softly, her hand on his shoulder. "Given the situation, with Clara, we need to make sure things are clear. We need to protect ourselves." A tired, sad man who just wanted the fighting to end agreed. He went back to his lawyer and signed a new document, a codicil that overrode his old will. This new paper stated that Eleanor was now the sole and absolute owner of everything, with no conditions, no bridge clause. It was as if Clara had been erased. What Arthur did not tell Eleanor, and what she never knew, was that he did not destroy the original will. The man who believed in history, in preserving the truth, could not bring himself to burn the document that held his original promise to his daughter. He simply placed it in a separate folder with his lawyer, a hidden piece of history, a secret seed waiting in the dark for its time to grow. He died a few months later, his heart heavy, believing he had lost his daughter forever, unaware that the most important part of his legacy for her was still safely tucked away. Of course, the phone call came on a Tuesday morning. Clara was in her small apartment, trying to focus on a drawing for a freelance project, when the unknown number flashed on her screen. The voice on the other end was formal, gentle, but it carried a weight that made her stomach drop. It was her father's lawyer, the man who had been a family friend for years. He said the words she had been dreading for months, ever since their last strained conversation. "Clara, it's about your father. I'm so sorry, but he's gone." The world seemed to slow down. The sounds from the street outside her window faded into a dull hum. Her father, the man with the kind eyes and the soft voice, was gone. And with him, the last fragile thread connecting her to her old life had snapped. The anger and the hurt from their fight were still there, but now they were swallowed by a vast, empty ocean of grief. He was gone, and she would never have the chance to make things right. The funeral was a quiet, somber affair. Eleanor had organized everything. She stood at the front of the small chapel, dressed in elegant, stark black, playing the part of the grieving widow perfectly. Her eyes were dry, her posture rigid. Clara sat at the back, feeling like an intruder, a ghost at her own father's farewell. She felt the stares, the whispers. She was the daughter who had left, the one who had caused him pain in his final months. The guilt was a physical weight on her chest. After the service, a small group gathered in the home she had grown up in. The house felt different. It was cleaner, colder. Her father's favorite armchair was gone, replaced by a modern, stylish one. His books, while still on the shelves, seemed neatly arranged as if they were decorations and not beloved treasures. The soul of the house was missing. A few days later, they all met in the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The room was wood-paneled and quiet, smelling of old books and lemon polish. It reminded Clara painfully of her father. She sat in a chair opposite Eleanor, not looking at her. The lawyer, looking older and more tired than she remembered, cleared his throat and began to read. The words were legal and complex, but their meaning became brutally clear very quickly. The new will, signed just a few months prior, left everything, the house, the savings, the investments, the entire estate, to Eleanor. Solely and absolutely. The lawyer's voice seemed to fade into the background as he read the final lines. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She wasn't just getting a smaller share. She was getting nothing. Not a single memento, not a book from his library, not a penny. It was a complete and total erasure. When the lawyer finished, there was a heavy silence. Clara finally dared to look at her stepmother. Eleanor's face was a mask of composed sadness, but for a fleeting second, Clara thought she saw something else in her eyes, a glint of triumph, of final victory. The lawyer folded the document. "I'm truly sorry, Clara," he said, his voice soft with genuine regret. Eleanor spoke then, her voice smooth as silk. "Thank you," she said to the lawyer. Then she turned to Clara. "Of course, Clara, you can come by the house to collect your personal things. Your clothes, your childhood items. I'll box them up for you." The words were a dismissal. They were a confirmation that she was no longer a part of this family, no longer a part of this home. The house she had grown up in, the walls that held all her memories of her father, was no longer hers to even visit. She was being given permission to pick up her leftovers like a beggar. Numb, Clara simply stood and walked out of the office. She didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. It felt like her father in his final act had confirmed every terrible thing she had feared during their estrangement. He had chosen Eleanor. He had cut her out. The bridge clause he had told her about as a child, that secret promise, had been a lie. Or he had changed his mind. The thought was the most painful one of all. The following weekend, she went to the house for the last time. Eleanor had indeed placed a few cardboard boxes by the front door. They were filled with old school books, some photo albums, and a few trinkets from her room. It felt impersonal, like clearing out a storage unit. "Take your time," Eleanor said, not inviting her in further. She stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel ensuring Clara didn't wander. Clara's eyes drifted past her into the living room. She saw her father's collection of history books, the very ones he had read to her from. She saw the fireplace where they had spent so many evenings. A lump formed in her throat. Is there maybe one of his books I could have?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just one as a memory?" Eleanor's face softened with a pity that felt colder than outright cruelty. "Oh, Clara, I'm sorry. But the will was very specific. Everything is part of the estate now. It wouldn't be right. I know he would have wanted his collection kept together. It was the final blow. Denied a single book, a simple token of the love that had once filled that house." She nodded, picked up the heavy boxes, and walked away from her childhood home without looking back. The years that followed were difficult. Clara built a life, but it was a life with a hollow space at its center. She worked hard, found a slightly better apartment, made a few friends. But the pain of her father's rejection was a shadow that never fully left her. She rarely spoke of him. When people asked about her family, she would give simple, short answers and change the subject. She heard bits and pieces about Eleanor through old acquaintances. Eleanor had traveled. She had redecorated the house, selling off some of the old clutter, which Clara knew meant pieces of her father's life. She lived well, enjoying the full benefits of the inheritance. Clara tried not to be bitter. She told herself that material things didn't matter. But it wasn't about the money or the house. It was about the message it sent. It felt like her father had rewritten their history, editing her out of the final chapter. She felt orphaned not just by his death, but by his last wishes. She created a quiet, simple life for herself. She surrounded herself with her own art, her own books, building a new history from scratch. But sometimes, late at night, she would take out the old photo album from the box and look at pictures of her father. She would trace the lines of his smiling face and wonder how it all went so wrong, and why the promise he made to a little girl by the fireplace had been so completely broken. She had no way of knowing that in a quiet law office, tucked inside a faded folder, that very promise was still alive, waiting patiently for its time to be remembered. The change in Eleanor's life began quietly, almost like the first shift in the wind before a storm. 5 years had passed since her husband's death, and the large house, once a symbol of her victory, had begun to feel like a cage. The rooms were too big, the silence too deep. The history in the walls felt heavy, and it was his history, not hers. She found herself wandering past his old study, now a formal sitting room she never used, and the memories were more irritating than comforting. She had met a man on one of her trips abroad. He was charming, worldly, and talked of a life filled with sun and sea in a beautiful villa overseas. He represented a fresh start, a new story where she was the main character, not just the widow who had inherited a dead man's life. The idea took root in her mind and grew quickly. She decided she would sell the house, liquidate everything, and move across the ocean to begin again. The decision brought her a new energy. She started the process with brisk efficiency. She hired a real estate agent, a sharp young woman who talked about staging and market appeal. This meant packing away more of her late husband's remaining belongings, storing them in the garage to make the house look less lived in, more like a blank slate for a new family. Eleanor didn't mind. She was eager to erase the past. Meanwhile, Clara's life had found a slow, steady rhythm. The sharp pain of her father's passing and the disinheritance had dulled into a constant, low ache, like an old injury that acts up when the weather changes. She had built a small, quiet existence for herself. She worked as a freelance illustrator, her apartment filled with her own artwork and the few personal items she had managed to salvage from her old life. She had learned to be content in her solitude, though the feeling of being cut off from her roots never truly left her. One afternoon, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from a lawyer, but not the old family friend. This name was unfamiliar. The subject line was formal: inquiry regarding the Vance family trust. Her heart gave a little jump. At first, she assumed it was some kind of mistake or a clever scam. She almost deleted it, but something, a tiny flicker of curiosity, made her open it. The email was polite and direct. The lawyer introduced himself as representing the firm now handling the sale of her late father's property. He stated that during their standard due diligence process, a routine check of all legal documents tied to the estate, they had encountered a complexity. They had found reference to an older will and an associated trust document that named her, Clara, as a contingent beneficiary. He asked if she would be available for a brief conversation to help them clarify the matter. Clara read the email 3 times. The words contingent beneficiary felt alien and confusing. Her first emotion was not hope, but a fresh wave of sadness and confusion. Was this some new trick? A cruel joke? She thought of her stepmother and felt a cold dread. She didn't want more drama. She had spent years building a peaceful life, and the thought of reopening that old wound was terrifying. For 2 days, she did nothing. The email sat in her inbox, a digital ghost from a past she had tried to bury, but it nagged at her. The phrase contingent beneficiary echoed in her mind. What did it mean? Finally, her need for answers overpowered her fear. With a trembling hand, she called the number in the email. The lawyer was professional and calm. He explained it to her slowly. When a large asset like a house is sold, he said, we have to trace the history of its ownership. We found that your father's original will placed his assets, including the house, into a trust for his wife, but it seems that trust had a specific clause. It stated that upon the sale of the primary asset, the house, or upon the wife's passing, the remaining assets from the sale would not go to her general estate, but would instead pass to you. Clara was silent, trying to process this. I was told the new will erased all of that. I was told I got nothing. Ah, the lawyer said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. That is the complexity. The newer document, the codicil, gave your stepmother full ownership and control during her lifetime. It did not, however, formally revoke and destroy the original trust. It's a subtle but very important difference. The bridge or contingent clause in the original trust was never properly dismantled. It was just forgotten. He went on to explain that because Eleanor was now choosing to sell the house, she was triggering that hidden clause. The life interest was being ended by her own action. The money from the sale, by the terms of the original trust her father had set up with such care, was destined for Clara. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara sat down heavily on her sofa, the phone pressed to her ear. It wasn't about the money. It was about the meaning. Her father had kept his promise. He had tried to protect her. The secret seed he had planted all those years ago had finally broken through the concrete of the new will and was growing into the light. She felt a sob catch in her throat, but it wasn't a sob of sadness. It was one of overwhelming relief. For 5 years she had carried the belief that her father had written her out of his heart. Now she knew he had fought to keep her in, right until the end. He had built a safeguard, a piece of legal history to protect her future, just as he had always said he would. The lawyer was still talking, outlining the next steps, The need for formal documentation, the potential for a legal discussion with her stepmother. But Clara barely heard him. She was thinking of her father, of his kind, tired eyes, and of the hidden love that had been waiting for her all this time. Tucked away in a dusty file finally found. The news hit Eleanor like a physical shock. She was in the middle of packing a porcelain vase when her lawyer called, his voice tight and serious. He explained the situation using words like dormant trust and triggering event. At first, she refused to believe it. It was nonsense, a mistake. She had the will, the final will, right there in her filing cabinet. It clearly stated she was the sole owner. But the original trust document was never revoked, her lawyer repeated, his tone patient but firm. Your husband's initial plan for the estate included a clause for his daughter that was contingent on the sale of the house. By selling it, you've activated that clause. The vase slipped from her hands and shattered on the hardwood floor, but Eleanor barely noticed. A cold, sharp anger began to push aside her initial disbelief. This was Clara's doing. It had to be. That quiet, seemingly timid girl had been plotting this all along, waiting in the shadows to steal what was rightfully hers. The inheritance wasn't just money to Eleanor. It was her reward, her security, the proof of her final victory over the ghost of her husband's first wife and his difficult daughter. She immediately instructed her lawyer to fight it. It's an old piece of paper. He changed his mind. He wanted me to have everything, she insisted, her voice rising. She refused to halt the sale. The overseas move, the new life with her partner, it was all within her grasp. She would not let Clara ruin it. Meanwhile, Clara was grappling with a storm of her own emotions. The relief of knowing her father had not abandoned her was immense, a warm light filling a cold space inside her she had long accepted as permanent. But that relief was quickly followed by a deep, gnawing anxiety. The lawyer had been clear. Eleanor would not give up without a fight. The thought of a long, ugly legal battle terrified her. She had no money for lawyers, and the emotional cost of facing her stepmother again felt overwhelming. She met with her new lawyer, a calm woman who specialized in estate law. The office was quiet and modern, a world away from her father's old lawyer's book-lined room. She's going to fight this, isn't she? Clara asked, her voice small. Most likely, the lawyer replied gently. But the law is surprisingly clear on this. Your father's original intent, as documented in the properly executed trust, is powerful. He created a safety net for you. The fact that the house is being sold makes the case very strong. We are not arguing that the new will is invalid. We are arguing that it didn't cancel the old trust. It's a technicality, but it's a strong one. The lawyer laid out the path forward. They would send a formal legal letter to Eleanor's lawyer, stating their claim. This would likely begin a process of negotiation. They could settle or they could go to court. The court option is long, expensive, and public, the lawyer warned. Everything becomes a matter of public record. All the family disagreements, all the private pain, it all gets aired out for anyone to see. Clara felt sick. She didn't want that. She didn't want to drag her father's memory through the mud. She just wanted what he had intended for her. She wanted the truth to be acknowledged. The formal letter was sent. The response from Eleanor's side was swift and aggressive. It was filled with accusations, claiming Clara was an opportunist trying to exploit a legal loophole to steal from a grieving widow. They threatened a brutal countersuit for emotional distress and legal fees. For Clara, reading those words was like being slapped. The anger and bitterness leaping off the page were so intense it was almost frightening. It confirmed her worst fears about what this process would be like. Weeks turned into a tense stalemate. The sale of the house was put on hold. Clara's life was put on hold. She couldn't focus on her work. She jumped every time the phone rang. The stress was a constant humming noise in the background of her life. Her lawyer advised patience. This is often how it starts. Anger, then bluster. We wait for the emotion to settle, and for their lawyer to advise them on the reality of their legal position. During this difficult time, Clara found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She went to the small box of her personal things she had taken from the house. Buried under old school yearbooks was a small cloth-bound journal. It was hers from when she was about 14. She opened it, her eyes scanning her own clumsy teenage handwriting. It was filled with silly thoughts, dreams, and then she found it. A single entry. Today, Dad explained the bridge to me. He said it's his promise that no matter what, his love for me is built into the foundation of our family. It's like a secret path back home. I didn't really get it, but it made me feel safe. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words. He hadn't just told her about a legal clause. He had given her a metaphor, a story of his love and protection. He was a historian, a man who believed in the power of stories and documents to preserve truth. He had preserved his love for her in the only way he knew how, by writing it down and trusting that the truth would, one day, find its way out. This realization didn't take away the fear of the legal fight, but it gave her a core of strength. This wasn't about greed or revenge. It was about honoring her father's true wish. It was about making sure his story ended the way he had originally written it. She wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for his legacy. And for the first time since this all began, she felt ready to see it through. The standoff stretched into months. The beautiful house sat empty, its for sale sign a silent monument to the family conflict happening behind closed doors. Letters flew back and forth between the lawyers, each one more pointed and expensive than the last. Eleanor's position was one of pure outrage. She refused to believe the law could be so unfair, so illogical. How could an old piece of paper override her husband's final wishes? But slowly, quietly, the reality began to seep through her anger. Her own lawyer, while still fighting for her, started to use words like significant risk and unlikely to succeed in court. He explained that the original trust was a legally sound document. The bridge clause was not a mistake. It was a carefully constructed plan. A judge, he warned, would likely look at the evidence and see a father's clear intent to provide for his daughter, an intent that was never formally canceled. The financial pressure was also mounting. Her plans for a new life overseas were frozen. The costs of maintaining the large house, along with her own living expenses and now the growing legal fees, were eating into the savings she had. The inheritance was starting to feel less like a treasure and more like a weight pulling her underwater. One afternoon, she received a letter from Clara's lawyer. It was different from the others. It wasn't filled with legal threats. Instead, it contained a formal offer for a settlement. It laid out a proposed division of the proceeds from the sale of the house. It was a significant amount that would go to Clara, acknowledging her rightful claim under the trust, but it also left a larger, still very substantial amount for Eleanor. The letter stated clearly that this was to avoid the pain and public exposure of a trial, and to allow both women to move on with their lives. Eleanor read the offer in the silence of the big, empty house. For the first time, the fight seemed to drain out of her. She was tired. Tired of the anger, tired of the battle, tired of living in a house that had never truly felt like her own. She looked around at the perfectly staged rooms devoid of personal history, and she saw not a home but a transaction. This settlement offered her a way out. It offered her freedom, the freedom to take her money, start her new life, and leave all this bitterness behind. On the other side of the city, Clara was a bundle of nerves. The idea of a settlement had been her lawyer's, but Clara had agreed to it with a trembling heart. She didn't want to take everything. She just wanted what was fair, what her father had intended. She wanted the truth to be recognized, not to destroy her stepmother. When her lawyer called to say Eleanor was willing to negotiate, Clara felt a wave of relief so strong it made her knees weak. It was the first sign that this nightmare might have an end. The final negotiation happened not in a courtroom, but in a neutral conference room. The two women did not look at each other. They spoke through their lawyers. It was tense and formal, but it was not a war. It was a business meeting to dissolve a painful partnership. After several hours, an agreement was reached. It was very close to the original offer. Clara would receive the portion of the estate that the trust had designated for her, and Eleanor would receive the rest, free and clear. When the papers were finally signed, Clara expected to feel a surge of victory, but instead she felt a profound and quiet peace. It was over. The ghost that had haunted her for years had been laid to rest. A few weeks later, the money was transferred. It was more than Clara had ever seen in her life, but the number in her bank account felt abstract. The real value was in the closure. She allowed herself a few days to simply breathe, to let the reality of her new safety and stability sink in. One evening, she was looking at her old journal, the one with the entry about the bridge. She thought about her father, the historian, the keeper of stories. He hadn't just left her money. He had left her a lesson in truth and patience. He had taught her that the real story is always there in the documents, in the evidence waiting to be found. And then, an idea began to form. It wasn't a grand plan, but a quiet, simple one that felt perfectly right. She contacted the local university where her father had taught for so many years. She spoke to the head of the history department, a man who remembered her father fondly. She told him she wanted to create a scholarship in her father's name. It would be for students who showed a deep love for history. Not just good grades, but a genuine passion for the stories of the past. She funded it with a part of the inheritance, ensuring it would continue for years to come. At the small ceremony to announce the scholarship, Clara was asked to say a few words. She was nervous, standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of students and professors. "My father," she began, her voice soft but clear, "believed that history was not just about the past. He believed it was a bridge that connects us to who we are and guides us toward who we can be." She didn't explain the legal battle or the hidden clause. She simply spoke about his love for stories and his desire to pass that love on. "He built bridges in his life," she said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "And now this scholarship will help others cross into their own futures." Later, she walked through the campus the same paths her father had walked. The weight was gone. The money had given her security, but this act of turning the pain of the past into hope for the future, this had given her back her story. She had reclaimed her father's legacy, not by fighting for a house, but by honoring his love for history and for her. The hidden clause had been found, and in the end it had built a bridge not just to an inheritance, but to a new beginning.